Hi, y'all, and welcome to tonight's live stream. Well, yesterday, the court unsealed a hearing in the Bryan Kohberger case. Up until now, it's been sealed. No one from the public has read it. The Bryan Kohberger case, of course, involves a criminology student who is accused of murdering 4 University of Idaho college students: Kaylee Goncalves, Maddie Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. All 4 students were stabbed in the middle of the night in the home where the 3 girls were living in Moscow, Idaho, as they went to college. So far, we haven't learned much in the way of evidence against Kohberger, but we do know about one critical, explosive piece of evidence, and that's the DNA found on the knife sheath underneath Maddie Mogen's body as she was in the bed where she would have been sleeping. Now, according to prosecutors, Bryan Kohberger's DNA was found on that knife sheath, directly linking him to the crime scene. So, yesterday, as I said, the court unsealed that hearing in the Bryan Kohberger case. It is packed with new facts, critical new facts, important new information. It's a hefty 175 pages, but I spent all day reading this so I could bring it to you tonight. It is huge and it is packed with information, as I said. We're going to be covering all of that tonight, or at least some of the highlights tonight. We won't be able to cover all 175 pages, obviously. So here's how this hearing came about. Back in January, the court was holding a sealed hearing, and it was dealing with the defense argument that this DNA should be kept out of evidence. It's all important in the case because it is the biggest link between Bryan Kohberger and what happened. So it's not really surprising that the defense is fighting hard against this evidence. One of the key arguments is that law enforcement traced this DNA back to Bryan Kohberger using investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, also called during this hearing FIG, forensic investigative genetic genealogy. So they went through, in other words, what that means, they went through DNA databases to build out a family tree for Bryan Kohberger, and ultimately then to finger him for the crime. So they found people who were close to the DNA that they had found at the scene, and they got closer and closer and closer until they were finally able to narrow it down, and they determined it must be Bryan Kohberger. So I'm looking over here to see, are we okay with the reception and so forth? There seems to be some discussion about that. So hopefully it is all okay. We have good audio and video. Okay, that's good. Good to know. Okay. So I want to start with, and we'll go ahead and put the document. Well, I'll wait to hold the document on the screen. As I said, it's huge. We're going to be zipping through it, going through thing after thing. First of all, and one of the key facts is that law enforcement did not know about Bryan Kohberger until the genetic genealogy fingered him. They didn't know about this. That makes this really the perfect test case legally for the whole issue around IgG. So Detective Brett Payne said he had never heard Bryan Kohberger's name, he's the lead detective, until December 19th, when the FBI turned over Bryan Kohberger's name. And by then, that also means Bryan Kohberger had been stopped twice by local police, once in August and once in November. But law enforcement, in other words, was not connecting either of those traffic stops to the person who committed the murders. The August one had not been connected in any way, and also the November one still had not been as well. Bryan Kohberger also was stopped twice on his cross-country trek across the United States as he headed back home to Pennsylvania. There's been a lot of discussion about whether those stops were really efforts by law enforcement to sort of keep track of him and determine where he was going, who he was with, what he was doing. And we have actually seen some video from at least one of those traffic stops. But apparently, neither of those stops had anything to do with the investigation of the murders or with law enforcement suspecting him. He was either just a bad driver or really unlucky. I don't know which. But by December 19th, law enforcement was already filling out an arrest warrant for somebody. They didn't yet know who it would be. And the parts that were specific to Bryan Kohberger were added later, after the FBI turned over his name to local law enforcement. The more general parts had already been filled out before law enforcement even knew his name, just talking about what happened at the scene, the people they interviewed, and so forth. So, as I said, this is sort of the perfect test case then for this IGG, because it's truly a case where the only way that law enforcement got to Bryan Kohberger was through this investigative genetic genealogy. So the courts can, in sort of a relatively pure fashion, look at the issues around this, including the allegation that the FBI accessed forbidden databases. But we will get to that. It's also in this hearing. So the second thing that I think was a pretty explosive and important fact, and by the way, the biggest one for most of you will be the very last one, so don't forget to stick around. So the FBI obtained DNA of at least 5 men, probably 4 of those were at the scene. There's one we don't really hear anything about. Now, male A left his DNA on the knife sheath underneath Maddie Mogen. Now, that DNA has been identified as Bryan Kohberger. Law enforcement swabbed the entire length of the leather strap and underneath the button, but they didn't swab the top of the button. And their theory was that that would be the most likely place to find a fingerprint. So they didn't want to do anything to interfere with that. I assume no fingerprints were found because we've heard nothing about fingerprints. Now, male B's DNA came from a blood spot on the handrail going between the second and the first floor. The murders happened on the second floor and also on the third floor. So the killer would not necessarily have had to have gone up and down the stairrail. And of course, blood DNA could have come from anything. It could have come from some other source, some other time. It doesn't have to be connected to the murders of the 4 college students. But obviously, the fact that it's found that they were able to identify it as blood, all of that makes it something that they clearly want to look at. But the fact that it was between the second and the first floor, a lot of people have been wondering about that. Where exactly was it found? Which handrail? And now we know the answer to that. It's a critically important fact, but oddly, law enforcement apparently elected not to pursue this fact, not to find out who male B was. They didn't do any testing or follow up on that. Let me add to the stage, and I'm going to be zipping through this document. So let's see. I'll have to look it up. Okay. If I told you, this is a question. If I told you the lab report showed unknown male B came from a blood spot on the handrail going between the second and the first floor, does that help jog your memory? Answer, yes, ma'am. And by the way, this is questioning of the lead detective that we're reading from the transcript itself right now, the one that's been released. It's redacted, but frankly, almost barely redacted. All they took out was names. For example, of the roommate, they removed her name, a few other names, but mostly they left everything in. Question, why did you not pursue that person? Answer, at that point in time, we had already received Mr. Kohberger's name. And from what my understanding was, entering another DNA profile into CODIS would remove the previous one we had from the knife sheath. So if memory serves, the discussion was, we'll hold off, we'll stay with the one from the knife sheath. If we need to, we can address the unknown male B at a later time. I have to say, that doesn't make any sense to me. CODIS, just to kind of keep us all up to date, CODIS is an information database involving DNA. And the DNA comes from several sources. It comes from people who have been convicted of a crime. It comes from victims who are, well, it comes from missing persons, not straight from victims. It comes from missing persons, and it comes from when a body is found and hasn't been identified. Some states also allow the law enforcement to put in DNA of people who have been arrested but have not been convicted. But for that reason, it's a pretty limited database. It doesn't include most people. It only includes people who are interfacing with the criminal justice system in some way. And so they put Kohberger's DNA, as they say it, they put male A, we'll put it that way, they put male A's DNA into CODIS and they got nada. And that's not a surprise. They say it's Bryan Kohberger's and he had never been convicted of a crime. That's why they didn't get any hits. But It doesn't make any sense to me that they can't enter another DNA profile into CODIS without removing the previous one from the knife sheath. I mean, could they not find another computer or access it through somebody else's data? I mean, it just doesn't make sense because clearly crimes can be committed by more than one person. So why would CODIS be set up that as soon as you put one in, it erases it? And even if it did, couldn't they just run it again or couldn't they print it out? To me, this doesn't really make any sense as to why they are unable to continue this, why they're unable to access another person's DNA. And so it does seem to me that that's sort of odd. And then this next question and answer also doesn't make sense. Question, I want to make sure I understand your testimony. Were you not aware of unknown male B until after December 19th when you knew Bryan Kohberger's name? Answer, no, ma'am, I was aware of that before. Yes. Again, which would suggest that you would think law enforcement would want to know who male B was, and why they had not pursued that is, I don't know. I find that really confusing. I hope that we will get more answers on that in the future, but it was certainly an odd point. Let's see if I've read everything that I wanted to read there. Yes. Okay. I'm going to pull that back out and we'll talk a little bit more. So the defense suggested that male B might have been a mixture, meaning, in other words, a DNA sample coming from more than one person where DNA was mixed together. But the witness, who by this time was Rylene Nolan talking about male B, said she didn't really know whether or not it was a mix or not. So got me on that. Presumably there would have been a male C, but we heard nothing about male C. We don't know where that was found, what it has to do with anything. I assume it was at the scene, but in any event, now male D came from a sample of blood on some gloves outside the house. And that's really all the information we got about male D. Male E, it sounds like, is Bryan Kohberger's dad. Shortly before Kohberger was arrested, police had followed Kohberger home and were intently watching his house in Pennsylvania. They even did a trash pull, which means they pulled trash from the trash can at the home after it was discarded. So we can guess that Bryan Kohberger anticipated that because he was throwing his trash, we've been told, into the neighbor's trash can, had been packing his trash into plastic bags. Now, when they did the trash pull, police identified male E and male A on the knife sheath and calculated a paternity statistic. I am not sure whether they could tell that which was the dad and which was the son, but in any event, they could tell they were related by paternity. One was the dad and one was the son. Now, there were questions about why they didn't manually compare the knife sheath DNA to male E. And let me go ahead and pull that up. That's on page 83, and I'll add this back to the stage. I'm not understanding, this is the question from Bryan Kohberger's attorney, why 95.9.1 couldn't have been manually looked at to do a manual comparison to the sheath DNA just to say excluded or not, when male E was compared to multiple items of evidence and it was excluded. But you don't know that until you do the comparison. Is that right? Answer, correct. So you can look at it manually, but if we're now making a probative statement, then we need to provide a statistic. And male E was also a single source, which is different than a mixture of DNA from multiple people. So I was unclear exactly why the defense was pushing for there to have been some kind of manual comparison. I don't understand. I will fully admit why that's so important. Is Kohberger attempting to imply his dad was the person who left the DNA on the knife sheath, or at least that it would create reasonable doubt? And oddly, there were mixes of DNA in the trash, but they never compared those to Bryan Kohberger's DNA. So the lab was tasked with testing from the pulled trash, and they said, and in any event, I cannot fully explain why they would not have tested that against Bryan Kohberger's DNA, but that was the testimony that they did not. The third point, law enforcement might have been closing in on Bryan Kohberger, headed in that direction without yet knowing his name, even before the FBI took over. But there are some odd things about this, and we learned that from the hearing. Now, before the FBI took over the IGG search, Idaho law enforcement was using an outside company called Othram to try to trace the DNA. Now, Othram was apparently on the right track, but they were several degrees away from finding Bryan Kohberger. In fact, Othram had traced the DNA to a grandfather and grandmother and wound up somehow from there with 4 brothers that Othram thought bore some further investigation. It wasn't that they were suspected of the crime, but that they might be related, maybe somewhat distantly, to the person who left the DNA on the knife sheath at the scene. They were just several degrees away from that person. Now, in a phone call, not in a written report, Othram requested that law enforcement contact these 4 brothers. And that's important and a little strange because it means that there were no documents to turn over to the defense. Instead, Othram did this by phone, contacting the brothers. And probably this tracing is especially important because law enforcement wants to be able to argue that even if Bryan Kohberger's rights were violated, and they clearly are not admitting that, they 100% are not admitting that, but even so, that they would have traced this to Bryan Kohberger anyway, that there were other routes. They were already well on their way. That might be the argument that they're trying to make. But bizarrely, not one of these brothers was named Kohberger, which I suppose means maybe this came down from the mother's side. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the, and let me change up our look here and let's go back and, all right. What's their recommendation to you? And this is Othram to law enforcement. The answer, their recommendation to my memory, to my recall, was that they had several individuals that had the potential to be of interest in this investigation. They asked us if, to further their family tree building, if we could be in contact with individuals and see if they were willing to contribute information into the databases that they were using in order to further the family tree building and further the geological work. I think it means probably genealogical work. Question, was it your understanding that these were 4 brothers? Yes. We just wanted to make sure there was some reason why Othram Laboratories was asking us to go and ask these individuals to put their DNA into the database that law enforcement can search. So we just did some work to build just very cursory family trees to see what connection these individuals might have and to verify these individuals were indeed brothers, things of that nature. Question, did you verify they were 4 brothers? Answer, I don't know that we would use the word verify, but we believed that the information was reliable that they had given us based on the publicly accessible information. Question, the last name of those brothers, we're here today and Bryan Kohberger's name has been on the news for 2 years. You know his name. That wasn't the last name. Answer, that was not the last name. Further answer, Detective Vicki Gooch with the Idaho State Police, that we asked her to reach out to one of the brothers we believe have put information into a genealogical database, ask him if he would be willing to upload that into one of these databases so they could further build out and use that information. He was skeptical about her contact, and so there was another contact, a 3-way call made between myself, Vicki, and this individual for purposes of trying to validate this was indeed a law enforcement investigation. This was indeed a legitimate request. And at that point, that individual requested not to be contacted again, was not interested in participating. Question, during the time leading up to that phone call, when you were building your family tree, I know none of the 4 brothers had the last name Kohberger. That name didn't come up when you were building the family tree either, did it? Answer, no. So what's really odd about this is they try to trace back through these 4 brothers, and they say the brother says, I don't want to be involved. I don't want anything to do with this. Don't contact me again. Law enforcement kept absolutely no records of their attempt to reach the 4 brothers. And Othram kept absolutely no records of having notified law enforcement that it was supposed to be searching for those 4 brothers. At least that's my understanding of the way that I read this. And that seems, I have to say, that seems kind of weird. Why is no one talking? Why are they not documenting any of this? And there were questions around that from the defense. So now the matches that Othram had reported were what they describe as low matches. That means they were probably something like third cousins. The individual who left the crime scene DNA descended from the second great grandparents of those two matches, is what they said. They were following a family tree, though, that could have led to Kohberger had they been able to trace it a bit further. Now, Othram got that DNA and was doing its work. It got it starting on November 22nd, but it was abruptly told to stop work on December 10th. And let's take a look at what happened here. Did you learn that first Othram worked on the case and then the FBI took over? Answer, yes. So Othram, I believe they were contracted based on the invoice I've seen. They were contracted to do the lab work. So to actually generate a SNP profile, upload it to GED Match Pro and Family Tree DNA, presumably through the approved portals. And then I believe they were contracted to do the genetic genealogy, but they were told to stop work, I believe, on December 10th. And I've seen the preliminary report they wrote. So they sent a preliminary report, which I presume was said, we traced back to these people and that's where we stop, at least at this point. And at that point, after the preliminary report, they were removed from the case and the FBI was substituted on there. So that's odd for a couple of reasons. Let me pull this out and talk a little bit more. So first of all, there's a lot of odd stuff going on around Othram and what they did and why they aren't making records. And secondly, it's unclear why the case was pulled from Othram. The Idaho State Police had a contract with this company, carefully negotiated. A couple of different people talked about negotiating this contract. And it was not just to do this case, it was to do this kind of testing for the Idaho State Police. And suddenly then it got yanked from Othram. It got sent to none other than the FBI. So I want to take those 2 points separately and start with the questions around Othram. There were questions that the defense was asking related to whether the company was qualified at all. They sort of hinted around this. For example, apparently it may not have been accredited, but the witness said, well, at that point in time, nobody was accredited. There were also questions about whether its instruments were validated, but there were even more questions about what was preserved from what Othram had done. It sounded like from questioning that maybe Othram didn't preserve any notes at all of what it had done. Maybe it didn't even keep lab notes, which frankly would be shocking if that is the case. And as I said, neither Othram nor the Idaho State Police kept any records of the search for the four brothers, the request that they be searched for, and then the actual effort to reach at least one of them. And so, and to me, it is very odd that law enforcement wouldn't have records. Tried to call this person on this day. He said, don't call him again. It's just odd that they wouldn't keep records of that. Now, there were counters from the state that you don't have to be accredited to do good quality work. And in any event, it was clear that the FBI was put on the case. Othram was told to stop work. And from then on, the FBI took over and began the investigation. The witnesses said they didn't know why the switch was made to the FBI. Now, at that point, there are questions about what the FBI did with this. Apparently, the FBI has admitted that it violated rules put out by the Department of Justice and went into forbidden databases to trace back to Bryan Kohberger. That was exactly what the defense was saying might be the case. Now, the judge has said, this is irrelevant. I'm not going to keep out the DNA on the knife sheath just because of this. It's still coming in. But this is the argument that they were trying to reach, what they were trying to find out. So the FBI manages CODIS. That's that gigantic national DNA database. But as I said, it doesn't have everybody's DNA. It did not have Bryan Kohberger's DNA because he had never been arrested or charged with a crime. So at that point, but there are rules around it. And one is a set of rules put out by the Department of Justice and says, okay, you can use CODIS. You can't use other databases unless they allow you to. Now, profiles, and the reason for that is that there are DNA databases that individuals put their DNA in order to learn things about their health, learn things about, especially for adopted children, who their relatives might be, who their mother and father are. It's people just want to trace their genealogy, their ancestors, those sorts of things. So people put their data, their DNA into these databases. The databases, many of them have rules that say law enforcement cannot access these. And DOJ has said, yeah, if they say that, you can't do it. Then there are others who have opt-in and opt-out. According to one of the witnesses who testified, there are only two databases that can be used: Family Tree DNA and GED Match, which may be GED Match. I don't know how they say that. And law enforcement is allowed to search those, although people can even opt out of those. And the witness explained, this was an expert for the defense who explained that there were changes made around these rules after the Golden State Killer was arrested using investigative genetic genealogy, that there was a public outcry at that point about people not wanting their profiles searched by law enforcement. They wanted that to be confidential. And there was also, he explained, contention within the genealogy community where some people thought, yeah, that I don't think that should happen either. It got so contentious, he said, that at one point on one of the listservs, no one was allowed to reference that at all. They just weren't allowed to talk about it because it would head everybody down this sort of contentious path. So the FBI acknowledged, and let's take a look at, let me add this back to the stage, and let's take a look at what the FBI apparently said. This was not the FBI talking, but this is the expert for the defense. We did finally get a letter, this is the expert talking, from the FBI in which, so we specifically asked to know which of the matches were in which of the databases, and they did not tell us that, but they did give us a list of the databases they had uploaded to, and it included Family Tree DNA, GED Match Pro. Those are the two databases they're allowed to use, but it also listed GED Match. Not GED Match Pro, but GED Match. They're not allowed to go into the regular GED Match portal. And then finally, they admitted they had uploaded to MyHeritage. And so the defense is arguing that that was not permitted. The answer from the court and from the state was, it doesn't really matter if these are not permitted. The way to deal with that is not to exclude the evidence. There are other ways to deal with that, and excluding the evidence is a very harsh remedy that wouldn't be appropriate here. And the court agreed with that. The court agreed and made that decision as well. So additional points made in this hearing are that the FBI apparently did not turn over all of its documents. The FBI finished up the testing that it did, but it didn't turn over the family tree, and the expert argued that had to have been built out on Ancestry.com. It was hard to follow just seeing it in transcript form without pictures and exhibits to sort of document what he was saying. But he was saying there were little clues that someone had been here, that someone had connected these people and made a tree that then was not being turned over. And he argued it couldn't possibly be Othram having done it, because Othram only got to a very low level of match, I believe 60 and 70 for a couple of different people. Whereas now the match was all the way traced back to a level of 250, which was very high and would indicate that they were really getting close to the person who had left the DNA at the scene. So the government did not reveal to them the person who did the FBI testing. The FBI said it couldn't turn over the whole match. It also said it couldn't turn over the whole match because that would be 20,000 people. And the expert said, well, there's a tip off right there, because it would be impossible to have 20,000 matches if all you're doing is looking at these limited databases. So let's get into the new facts about what the roommates saw that were revealed very briefly. And then I'll take a few questions after that. Dolly has been a member for 5 months. That's fantastic. And she wants to do a shout out to the mods. I so appreciate that. Our mods are awesome. Marlon, mamapinks, denisepelton, so grateful for them. And Michael Lalonde sending videos. Thank you, Michael. All right, so let's take a look at what the roommates saw, because this is some new facts that we did not have before. And obviously, everybody has wondered. This is the only eyewitness who has some potentially relevant information. And so, all along, we have been wondering, what exactly did she see? And here is what we are told additional. And there isn't much, but it's interesting. And the question, how many times was, her name is redacted, interviewed by law enforcement at the time you wrote this December 23rd report? Answer, if memory serves, it was 4, I think, 3 or 4. Question, in the affidavit, you wrote a statement that she had heard Kaylee go upstairs, yell, someone's here, and run back downstairs. Is that correct? Answer, yes, ma'am. Question, and you use the words, she thought she heard. Do you remember that? And at that point, there is an objection from the prosecution. Your Honor, I'm going to object. I'm objecting based on the scope of what this testimony is supposed to be. Now, the court acknowledged that and ruled in the prosecution's favor, and there was no more questioning on this. But it's certainly a surprise, something pretty different from what we had known before. We'd heard that she heard somebody yelling. There had been some talk about there's somebody yelling, but this is very specific. She heard Kaylee go upstairs, yell, someone's here, and then run back downstairs. But we know that Kaylee's body was found upstairs. So all of this is new information and frankly, a little confusing. It isn't really clear how exactly this would fit in with what we know about the crime scene. We obviously are missing tons and tons of facts here, but it's certainly something different. And it would imply that Kaylee knew somebody was there. You would expect them to be much more struggle. And then the other 2 bodies were found down on the 2nd floor. So you might have expected them to be up on the 3rd floor figuring out what was happening. All of this is confusing, and it could be that this makes no sense in light of where the scene was. Thus, casting some credibility questions on the witness and on what the roommate saw and what she said. Up until now, probably the most important fact she talked about was the fact that she saw a man, slight build, and he had bushy eyebrows. That could fit Bryan Kohberger. Of course, it could also fit lots of other people. So that's what we knew pretty much so far, that there was some yelling. I think there was a dog barking, but now we have something more specific about a person who went upstairs, yelled, someone's here, and ran back downstairs, and specifically who that person would be. All right. So those are 7 really interesting and surprising, some of them, facts that we learned in the hearing that was unsealed. I want to give a shout out to the first 5 in our chat tonight: Michael Lalonde, Desert Rose, CT Annie, Mel Stiller, and Ed Gein. Appreciate that very much. Indie Girl has been a member for 9 months and says thank you to me and to the mods. I appreciate that. Thank you. All right, well, let's head over and see if people have some questions. If you have a question, if you could put question marks at the front of it, I'll have a better chance of spotting them in the chat. And I would like to see yours if you have a question. So let me take a look for question marks at the beginning. Is this trial likely to proceed this year? Jay Connolly asks. I honestly think so. It's been a pretty good amount of time. The amount of effort that is going into planning and preparing this trial is huge. The cost of having the trial extended, of pushing out the date, that's high. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure from the judge, probably from everybody, to keep the trial date on track. They've had plenty of time by now. So it's not like there's going to be some kind of push to it's new information. We didn't know this. We haven't seen it. It appears that there's been pretty much full discovery, and that they're now battling over the information, whether it comes in, exactly what they should be doing at this stage of the preparation for trial. So my guess is yes, but who knows? I mean, trials do get put off a lot. So that's not a crazy question, Jay Connolly, at all. So Sublime is asking why he had their driver's licenses in his car. I honestly thought, Sublime, that wasn't true, that was a rumor, but wasn't true. But that's the kind of fact that we just don't know yet. I don't know anyway. I don't know whether it's true or not. So we will find that out at trial. I think that would be a huge fact. Surely they would mention that at trial. Kat wants to know if I think there will be a plea deal. I really don't. I don't see why that would be in the state's interest. What could conceivably be in the state's interest about that? If they send Bryan Kohberger to prison, or the death penalty, they're even asking for that as well. If they give him the death penalty, then the one thing he could possibly buy would be life in prison, but not the death penalty. But what does he have to offer? What does he have to exchange? It's not like there's a body hidden somewhere and they're trying to trace it down. I just don't know what they would have, what he could offer them, as far as maybe just getting the trial over with, not having it happen. But my guess is that it will go on to trial. Barb asking about whether he corresponded with BTK. I believe he might have gotten a letter. No, that was Rhett Shearman. Rhett Shearman got that letter, right? I don't know. I don't know whether he has done that or not. That would certainly be creepy, huh? So people ask me if I think a witness is being truthful. I honestly can't say. That would not be. I just couldn't know. How long would you guess the trial will last? They have asked for a mega long time. Am I remembering 12 weeks? I think it's something crazy long. I don't see why it would take that long. I really don't get it. But I think they've asked for that. And that is just, that would be, 3 months of trial. I once had a trial that lasted 3 months. When we started, it was hot. It was hot summer. And by the time we left, it was snowing. So it was a very, very long trial. I was exhausted. And it was out of town. It was out of town too. All right, Rosie McCrank. Would you be interested, or is it even possible for you to go to Idaho to cover the trial? Rosie, I have definitely thought about that. It would be very interesting to do that. I don't think I could be out of town for 3 solid months, but I have thought about maybe attending parts of it, and I'll keep y'all posted as I, make decisions about that. If y'all have some input on that, let me know. I am hopeful that it will be broadcast. So we'll see. Catherine says there are rumors and falsehoods generated by the true crime community and the mass market media. How can this stay out of the public domain? I wonder if more things should be unsealed. Catherine, I'm a big believer in that. I really do think facts are the enemy of rumor, and obviously put us on the right path to actually understand what it is that's being said and what the truth is. And I think it's a shame when people hide that, and then what happens is that the rumor gets spread everywhere, and it really isn't based in fact. I think that's dangerous for everyone. I think that's dangerous for our justice system in general. So I do believe transparency is one of the best possible pieces of ammunition against this kind of thing. So I do agree with you. Phyllis, could the witness possibly have heard someone yell out from the 3rd floor and it was Kohberger running upstairs? So we have gotten insinuations from other hearings that the person may have said they've been drinking, and therefore maybe they were not. But it's just a hint. We don't really know much about that. But if so, maybe there was some confusion around that. It was also late at night. Maybe they were tired and there was some confusion around that. What I'm doing is simply reporting to you what was said at this hearing. And what was said at this hearing was that in an affidavit, he wrote a statement that the roommate heard Kaylee go upstairs, yell, "Someone's here," and run back downstairs. So law enforcement wrote this in an affidavit. I can only report what is actually stated in the hearing transcript. So then that was a big surprise. I haven't heard that before. And so that does say that's very confusing. Bama Queen asking about what my son says about 30 million views. Well, I alone am completely amazed. I just can't get over it. But he was so thrilled. I think he's really proud because he's the one who talked me into doing the channel. So I think he is so excited for this. He said, "I told you so," which of course he didn't actually tell me that. But I just thank you. I really can't say thank you enough for all of that. Talene asked, do you think the DNA argument might be heard by higher appellate court after the trial? Oh, definitely. 100% definitely. That is probably, well, since that's the centerpiece of the trial in terms of evidence, that's the most important link. Putting Bryan Kohberger at the scene underneath the body of Maddie Mogen with a knife sheath. That's all important. Is it the only piece of evidence? I'm sure it's not, but it is the most important piece of evidence. And so that evidence is, and the DNA argument is going to be the centerpiece of the appeal as well. That's exactly what they'll be arguing. Is the trial date set? It is. It is set for August and coming up rapidly without question. All right, I'm looking for question marks at the beginning of the questions or the chat. Tsunami wants to know, couldn't she have been referring to the DoorDash driver, considering she may not have known a delivery was coming? Certainly, she could have gotten confused, but this is an affidavit filed by law enforcement stating that she said it was Kaylee. So again, I'm just telling you what the transcript of the hearing said, and the answer from the witness was, yes, ma'am. Did in the affidavit you wrote this statement? Yes, ma'am. And you used the words she thought she heard. And so that's the sum total of what we know about it from this transcript. All right, looking for more question marks at the beginning. Sarah, saying, yes, I can't really answer about their honesty. Pray the new lawyer really helps Bryan Kohberger. And yes, I think that's the correct thing, is I can't really answer about a witness's honesty. So I appreciate your understanding that. But they'll just have to answer for that themselves. Shante wants to know what Shante, you have to go back to the beginning. This is really action-packed. We have learned a lot about the case from this unsealed secret hearing transcript. We've been waiting for this, and it's finally out and finally available. DB Cooper wants to know, what if the DNA is the only piece of evidence? I don't think it's the only piece of evidence, in that there's some other things that are sort of circumstantial, like the car being in the vicinity, like the phone being turned off, but those are far less direct. Those would probably not be enough for the state to get a conviction. What we know so far, just being in the area, driving around at night with your phone turned off, that might not be enough, but added to the DNA, that's what the prosecution is counting on. And that's why this fight over whether it comes in is so critically important to both sides. It's really going to make a difference in the case. Could there be an appeal based on not looking at the DNA of the blood evidence? Well, I think that definitely could be an argument, but it's the getting it in is more important. The not doing testing on some of the DNA is more, I think, of a jury argument, because then you can say, well, you had 4 people at the scene, and I'm guessing on the person, male C. We don't really know who male C was, but you had 4 people at the scene and you only tested for 1 and you didn't even bother to pursue the others. What are you thinking? Why would you not pursue that? Why did you not want to know who that person would be? And that can lead then into the cross-examination at trial. It can lead into what they talk about with the jury at trial. Matthew Rosen asking, am I covering the Karen Reed hearing tomorrow? I will. Tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern, I will be going live and talking about the Karen Reed hearing. The Donna Adelson also has a hearing tomorrow. I'll probably cover that on Wednesday, and I will not be going live on our regularly scheduled Friday, 7 p.m. Eastern. So we'll go at least tomorrow and Wednesday, and then we'll see about what happens after that. But tomorrow is going to be an unbelievably interesting hearing in the Karen Reed case. So Robin asking, is the CODIS excuse BS, and would it be not good for the trial? Well, one of the interesting comments made by the judge is that this entire investigative genetic genealogy issue may not come in at trial. That was stated in the transcript, that he said, I'm not even sure this will come in at trial. And there was, we deal with all of that later. But I can see where it would not. This is a threshold question of whether or not they reached Bryan Kohberger. How they reached him isn't really relevant to the jury. That's only relevant to the question of whether the evidence should be excluded. How they reached him isn't something that the jury probably will need to hear, and the judge may well rule it out. He's already hinted at that in this hearing transcript. So I think it may not affect the trial at all, except for the fact that the judges ruled that the DNA evidence will come in. And obviously that is going to have a massive impact. Okay, so all right. Well, I will see you all tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern. We'll be talking about the Karen Reed hearing that will happen tomorrow, and I will see you then.